Let's read the beginning of Daniel chapter 1. Really, it would have been good to read the whole chapter, but that's a lot to read with today. So, as we've been doing, I'd like to ask that you would just stand to your feet today, just out of a place of respect and attention given to God's word. I'm going to be reading from the New International Version. If you have a Bible, follow along, or if you have a phone you're using, or you can look up on the screen. You don't have to read with me, but would you just follow along with me as we read this? We're just going to break it off into seven verses and 5 verses to start off with today. So, starting in verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names, though. To Daniel, he named him Belteshazzar, and then to Hananiah, the names that we know well: Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. Verse 18. At the end of time set by the king to bring them into service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. This is God's word today. You can be seated. Maybe before we're done, you'll be able to spell Nebuchadnezzar. And you could use that in some, game. Can you spell Nebuchadnezzar? Maybe you'll get there. But we're going to be looking at this book for the next 8 or 9 weeks, and I think it's going to be a fun and a really, really good journey. Let me start, though, with the journey that Jerry and I just got off of. We just returned. She was with me for the first week or so, and then I was there for a few days without her being in England. And that was a special trip for her because, if you don't know, my wife was born and raised there. And so when our denomination asked if they could send me there for a conference to help with some pastors and also glean what Alpha is doing, she said I was not allowed to go without her. And so we got a chance to see her childhood home and the 2 neighborhoods she grew up on, which was very special. But it was amazingly that we planned this months and months ago that we ended up landing the day of the Queen's funeral, which for anybody in Great Britain is a big deal. And even for someone like my wife who was born there, she was like, that would just be so amazing. That is kind of a chance of a lifetime. So we said, let's see how we go, see if the plane takes off on time. And we did. We landed early, and landing in England for the first time, getting a rental car and driving out on the left-hand side was nerve-wracking enough. She just kept saying, get over to the left, get over to the left. And instead of driving into London where the big festivities were happening, and that seemed like suicide after 2 minutes in a car, we talked to our friends who lived there, and they said, go to Windsor because it's out of town, and she's not going to be there for hours, and probably is not many people. So we said, you know what, let's give that a try. We were already heading that direction, and so we did. We pulled into Windsor, my first time. So I like history, I like old things, I like castles, and so I'm excited to see the big Windsor Castle sign that says to the left. It was surreal that the sign right next to it was Legoland, make a right. That made me feel a little bit at home, other than make the right from the left-hand lane and cross over traffic, which still just feels very foreign. But anyway, Legoland to the right, Windsor Castle to the left. And we got there about 10 in the morning, found some free parking a couple miles away, and walked there and joined about 100,000 other people. Here's a picture of where we got able to stand, and there's Windsor Castle as she was finished with her trek all the way through, and then she came down the road. You can show the next picture there. Jerry took a cool one coming right down the road that let some people walk across there, so he was able to snap that. So she's coming. Now I know as Americans, we don't really quite understand and oftentimes don't even get too excited about any of this unless you've watched The Crown, and then you're hooked in. So, but it's different with this royalty and with king and queens. First of all, our country started because we decided we didn't want one, and you can feel that within the DNA of us, but there was something special about being there and standing there with about 100,000 people they estimated there. And there's a reason I'm sharing this with you too, but go ahead and go to the next one. Kind of ties into what we're talking about today. And so eventually this guard of different musicians and people wearing their obviously their formal uniforms all came from a different area of the United Kingdom. And then her motorcade came down. I have one more picture there you can see as the hearse was passing there. You can see the crown jewels on top and her casket there. And it really was something. As someone that's not been born and raised there and hasn't really gotten into the royalty aspect of that, there was something special and something you realize that most countries don't have this. And of course we know that the monarchy there is not someone who's ruling the country anymore and doesn't dictate policy or create law. They have a little bit of influence, but their job is to basically be servants of the country. But there's something that is of a neat pastime that you kind of sense in those moments. And I'm going to come back to this because there's a neat thread that we can talk about today. But really, to start with this, just makes me think the book of Daniel is truly a book about kings. And that's hard for us to understand in some ways since we've never had a king. Whereas I think if you read that there in Great Britain, there's an understanding somewhat of royalty. But this is what Daniel is going to get across. And in fact, he is already starting that journey in James chapter 1, verse 1 and 2, he's already beginning to take us on a journey, and then how he even ends the first chapter. We just read it. You probably didn't totally pick up on it. That's okay. We have to kind of slow down and really look at it. We're going to highlight this. But he's going to speak and talk to us about kings. But first, before I show you that, let's just do a quick kind of study of the time and the time period, the background of this story. Daniel was taken in captivity to Babylon, which would be modern-day Iraq today. It's not too far below Baghdad, right along the Tigris River. And he was taken in 606, 605 BC. Now, up until this point, there was only a couple great nations that kind of ruled large areas in this part of the East, certainly there, but in other parts of the world. But the first would probably be known to you, is if you're anybody that's familiar with the Bible or even has seen some contemporary movies, is the nation of Egypt. They were kind of the big ancient power, and this is a map of kind of the furthest extent of the Egyptian empire. They ruled for so long and ruled for such length of time that their borders changed a lot. But they were kind of the first kind of big nation. And modern day Israel is kind of right up here. You see Jerusalem. And so they had conquered a lot of that land. And even when they hadn't conquered that land, it was the temptation of Israel to always go down to Egypt to get taken care of. And God was constantly frustrated with them and challenging them, stop going to Egypt for help, I'm your God, right? But it's easy because they're there, it's tangible, it's physical, I can see it, I can see the protection, so there's this temptation to always go down there. But after a while, there came the first really world superpower, or again, maybe at least in the West, I think arguably in the whole world, but the first really big superpower that dominated a huge landscape was the Assyrians. The Assyrians, and here's a map. You can see they went further down that this doesn't show. It's hard to find good ones that you could see from far away today, but they had much of the Middle Eastern area, Iraq, some of Iran, Jordan, Jerusalem, some of Saudi Arabia, and all the small countries that we can never remember down in there, and part of Turkey, and I mean, a huge area. The Assyrian Empire, it started off with the kind of the dark green, then moved to the lighter green. They just kept conquering more and more lands. And this is important for us today because Daniel's going to play on this in the very first part of Daniel. And if you don't look at this a little bit, you miss a little bit of the punch that Daniel wanted to have. Okay, so this is the first major world superpower. And then right at the shift, moving from Assyria to Babylon, is where the story of Daniel begins to take place. Now, Babylon comes, the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar's father actually comes, and there's a resurgence. The Babylonian Empire actually existed before, but it was very small. And they have this resurgence, and it's Nebuchadnezzar's dad and him that eventually attack Egypt and subdue them, and then they attack Nineveh, which is also in modern-day Iraq, and they are able to destroy the main capital of Assyria, and they take them down. Go ahead and show. The Babylonian Empire, though, never quite reaches the level, the size of the Assyrian Empire. But here's what's significant. They are Assyria for nearly 200 years. They are the superpower of the whole area. Why I'm sharing all this with you is you have to get into the mindset of what's taking place. So they just rule. It's just king after king after king. They're wiping out everybody. In fact, can you show the picture from the museum? I stopped by the British Museum before I left so I could have some things for you on Sunday morning because I knew they have one of the largest areas of Assyrian and Babylonian artifacts in the world. I decided not to bore you any longer. If you'd like to come with me to coffee, you can go through Mark's little travel thing on my phone and I'll show you the hundreds of pictures I took. But this statue doesn't look so good on the TV, but up here, the statue was taken from one of the temples. They had statues like this at every temple, every gate. The Assyrians, they loved every time a new emperor, a new king would come, they would build bigger statues, bigger palaces, bigger walls, because they wanted to always one-up the previous person, right? I mean, we may be modern people with technology and a lot of things that have changed, but we're no different as humans. It's always the same. Like, I want to show you how much better and how much greater I am, how much more powerful I am. So they would always build something bigger and greater, and they have all kinds of artifacts. In fact, like I said, if you want to go to coffee, I'll show you. They have some of the picture words that they would put up for the stories that line the palaces of the Assyrian kings, and they showed several of those that showed them carrying away the Israelites when the Assyrians attacked Samaria and took them as a people. And then they also have the ones from Babylonia that show them when they attacked Judah and they took them, just what we just read right there, and took all of their prized possessions. They show them holding little carts that they're holding on their shoulders, and they have all these jewels and all the important artifacts of Judah and other countries, but Judah's one of them there on the wall that shows them as they're carrying all that back into Babylon. So it's kind of interesting to see the biblical just tied into the regular history that we have. Okay, why are you sharing all this, Mark? Okay, so when Daniel writes in verse 2, make no mistake about it, he chooses his words properly. He is talking about being taken from Jerusalem. It's a big town now, but puny and small and not part of a big country at this point. Go back to the slide of Babylon. I think it was that one. I'm sorry, can you go to the one with Assyria? Thank you, David, you're on your toes. Here you can see this would be the nation of Judah. This is the nation of Assyria. That's the nation of Judah. So then when Babylon comes, go to the next one, and they take over this country, it's not a big deal that they took this one, right? That's child's play. That's simple. The Babylonians are now the new world superpower. And Nebuchadnezzar comes and he takes who and what he wants, and he carries that tribute back into the storehouses of his gods to show off to everyone how great he is, how awesome and powerful he is, and his kingdom, right? And so, and there is, I think they have some of this in the British Museum too, but they found some of the artifacts of the exploits, and it always exaggerates, both the Assyrians and the Babylonians, how powerful they were and how they conquered all these people. But, so catch this, Daniel starts out his book in verse 2, being taken from the puny little country of Judah, from the little city of Jerusalem, taken all the way over to Babylon. He says this, or I might say he has the nerve in verse 2 to say it this way. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. That's almost fighting words. I'm just telling you. Nebuchadnezzar does not want to hear from a defeated enemy, we let you win. No, you didn't. I mopped up on you. I wiped you out. I took all of your God's prized possessions and I put them in my God's temple. I won. And Daniel's like, no, God let you win. Right? He is starting out at the very gate in Daniel 1, 2, and it is something that they were to know, all the people that were now exiled in the nation of Babylon, and all future people who would find themselves exiled or in places where it doesn't seem like God is ruling. And Daniel is saying to all of them for all of eternity, make no mistake about it. Don't ever confuse yourself just because someone wins some physical battle on earth. There is only one king, and he determines the course of history. He says, even though Nebuchadnezzar is the new world superpower who is wiping out everybody wherever he goes, don't confuse this. God let Judah fall into his hands. If God didn't want it to happen, it wasn't happening. And that's how he started his book. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. Nebuchadnezzar, you think you took our temple's artifacts and the things that... No. God gave them to you. And we'll see as we look at this over the next few weeks that Nebuchadnezzar had two problems in his life constantly. He was arrogant, and he thought he was amazing, and God humbled him. But while in the same time, in his arrogance, which pride always does, thinking he was so amazing because he conquered the superpower, all of that pride only ends up in insecurity, because what happens when you become the new world superpower and you think you did it on your own? You have to protect the new world superpower all on your own. You see, if God is the one who brings things about to pass in your life, you don't get insecure about when you may lose them, because you know from the beginning that God was the one who brought them in. But if your life is, I got here because of my looks, or because of my intelligence, or because of my strength, or how amazing I am, then the moment you achieve something or you get on top in some way, all the pressure falls on you because it was your intelligence or your good looks or your strength or your power that got you here. So now you have to spend your time holding it together, always looking out for the next person who may usurp you. And that's what Nebuchadnezzar did. Whenever he had his dreams, he was freaking out. Why was he freaking out? Because he figured they were premonitions of someone coming to get him, just like he got everyone before him. Your pride only goes so far, and then it ends up in just deep insecurity, which causes us even more stress and more pain. And so Nebuchadnezzar, he is going to be humbled by God. We'll look at that because he thinks he's amazing. Because according to the world, he is. He took out the Assyrians. But we see really quickly he's really nothing. He's a little insecure king who can't figure out his own dreams. And he has to go to a slave boy he took from Jerusalem to figure out what God is doing in the world. God was letting not only Daniel and all the Jews that have been taken into exile, and those not, that God was still king, but he was also going to let the nation of Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar and everyone else in his palace know there really is only one king. There really is only one king. This is my first point this morning, really simply, right out of the gate. God is the true sovereign king above all kings. Remember, we're doing this series right now as a reminder to us in the midst of our world, which, I mean, I'm not that old, though young people on staff say I'm pretty old now, thank you. But I've never heard, since I was a young man, the term nuclear being thrown around like we hear it right now in the news, huh? What's going on in our world? Well, I know at the end of the day, I have to trust that God is king. And for a lot of people, we look at things that have taken place in our nation, things that we disagree with, things that concern us, things that worry us on all different kinds of levels. And it causes us to have a temptation to want to panic, to want to be afraid. And Daniel is speaking to you, to me, to all of us. God is king. Don't get too caught up. In fact, we'll show you this at the end. But don't get too caught up with who's currently in power, because they're going to come and they're going to go. But God rules an everlasting kingdom, right? That's what he tells us. That's what we celebrate at Christmas in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6 and 7. For to us a child is born, and to us a son is given, and the government shall be on his shoulders. This was prophesied not long from this time that Daniel was writing. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. And of the greatness of his government and peace, there will be no end. So I challenged you a couple weeks ago, and you were hoping I wouldn't bring it up again, but I'm going to. You should pray. You should think hard about who you want to vote for. We live in an amazing country that allows people to vote, and there's not many nations like that in the world. Thankfully, there's more growing that way, but that's a great thing that we get to live here and we get to participate. But my challenge for you this time is to pray, think about it, figure out who you want to vote for, and get off, I'm serious, off social media and the news for the next 30 days until the election. Stay off of it and see if that changes anything. You've already decided who you want to vote for. Now remember, Nebuchadnezzar nor anybody else in the American government is the one who truly rules. God is sovereign. Participate, be involved in it, and then give it over to the Lord and trust him. No matter which way it goes, God will outlast all the presidents of the United States, all the kings of the world. He is sovereign. Listen, there's a lot of people that have read Daniel forever trying to predict what kingdoms are coming and when Jesus would come back. I am telling you, maybe there's some validity to that, but you miss the main point of it, which is Daniel trying to say, hey, do you find yourself in a place, in a time, in a nation where it doesn't seem like God is ruling? His number one message is God is still ruling. It's not a book to try to predict when God will come back, but to remind us that he is ruling until he comes back. And that's who God is, right? He is sovereign over all of these things. And I love that Daniel, right out of the gate, is hammering that. Now, a king is simply a ruler, someone who's in charge. And the way that this breaks down into our lives practically, personally is, there's things in your life that tell you it's in charge. It may tell you that unless you get a different job or you get paid more or you solve this problem in your family or you get married or you find a spouse or whatever it is, or this sickness goes away, it'll say things aren't going to get better. Things aren't going to change. You're not going to make it. Things aren't going to work out. Those are all false kings in your life telling you that they're in charge, just like Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel looked at them and he wants you to look at them and go, you are not king of my life. You're not king of my life. I love, I'll go back to it in much more detail, but this church that we visited, God is moving in this church, the Church of England. And they're seeing people come to know the Lord in a lot of impoverished areas. People that are never going to be able to afford to go into ministry, because the Church of England, you have to have a sponsor, you have to have multiple degrees, you have to go to really good schools, and the chances of most of those people having that kind of education are not going to happen. So they started something called the Peter Ministry. Incredible. They have 100 pastors, or soon-to-be pastors in this. They're not people that can become official pastors in their church, but they can become assistant pastors and help because they think the chances of them getting rightly educated and having the money is not going to happen. But you can become assistant pastor and make just as much influence. So they started this thing called the Peter Ministry. They have 100. They want 3,000, and I have no doubt they'll make it. They already have identified maybe more than 300. It's incredible what God's doing. But that's the thing. If they were to be told, which society would tell them most of the time, you can't make it, you can't be a vicar, you can't be a pastor of this, you haven't come from a family, you have nothing, you have no money. God's like saying, whoa, I'm king, I'm sovereign. And the purposes and plans that I have called you for will come to pass. And so don't spend your time or energy even worrying about what's been told to you. You focus on me. And this is what Daniel's doing. In fact, I think it's a key. I'm not going to get there today. I don't even know if we will make it. But I think it's the key to why Daniel said, I don't want to eat your food, by the way. It's really interesting. I know everybody loves, or some people love the Daniel diet. And Daniel wasn't trying to lose weight like Americans are with the Daniel diet. You find the Daniel bread in the store in the freezer section because it's barely bread. It's just staying alive in that freezer for a little bit of time. But what he basically was saying is, yes, I think there was some food that probably was tainted, given to idols in Babylon. But if you look at this, I think it's interesting. A lot of historians and commentators said, you could have said that about anything, even the vegetables that they were given, because they were maybe being grown with prayers towards their gods. They don't know for sure, but they said that at least part of it, and I would say I agree with this, at least part of Daniel's reason was maybe to avoid food that would have been defiling to him according to Jewish law. But more than that, he wanted everyone to know for sure that it was God who was doing the things in their life and not because they fed them certain food. See, I think Daniel knew God was going to do something with him. And he didn't want them to start giving themselves the credit. And how often in our lives does God sometimes tell us, hey, that shouldn't be part of your life. Hey, you should take that out of your life. And really what he's doing is we have things in our life that we give ourselves credit for. And it's not fun when God strips it away. But what is he ultimately doing? The greatest thing that God could do for any of us is for us to realize in an area of our life where we think we've done it or we've managed it or we've led it, for God to strip us of that, as uncomfortable that is, so that we learn, oh, wait a second. No. It's God's sovereignty. He's the one who's doing these things. And sometimes God allows us to. And I love that Daniel went ahead and led it and said, no. When it's all said and done, you're going to know that God is the one who's working through us. And it's not because of your special wine or your special food, right? It's because God is the one who's working through us. Okay, so God is the true sovereign king above all things. What are those pseudo-kings in your life that claim that they own you, that tell you certain things about your life? I want to just challenge you today. You turn to the Lord and say, God, I want to fulfill your purpose and your will for me, and there's nothing that anyone's going to get in the way. Listen, I'm all for, really, I know it gets blown into proportions and sometimes in negative ways, but we should attempt to live our lives trying to give everyone the same opportunities, the same equality of options. I mean, that's great that we work towards that, but you need to understand something. Sometimes that's just a human system, which is towards a good end, but even if you don't have equal opportunity, you have a king who can overcome all opportunity and all disadvantages. And we all need to remember that while we work to try to lift others up, I never have to worry that I'm not lifted up enough because God sees me. If God saw Daniel and these 3 men in exile in Babylon and was going to do something in their life, he can do something through any of our lives, right? So God is doing it. So I don't know what those kings are that claim they own you, but don't listen to them. Reject those things. Give up on those things. Psalm 10:16, the Lord is king forever and ever, and the nations will perish from his land. That's a great verse. It's really strong and powerful. God is king forever. But listen, Psalm 9 and 10, probably one psalm originally together, they were written to people who were struggling. The most common, or the question that's kind of repeated over and over again in different ways is, God, where are you? How long until you do something about all these terrible things that are happening? Is Psalm 9 and 10. And the writer then says in the midst of all those questions, but you know what? I don't want to forget, God's your king. Even when it doesn't seem like it. Even when I'm struggling to see where is the justice? Where are you, God, working? Where are you turning the tide? Don't ever forget that God is still king. He will have to inevitably call every generation into a unique place that he's going to be using in his kingdom, which is my second, really my final point. So simple today as we kick this off. God is sovereign, and God sovereignly, strategically places each of his servants in his kingdom, in earthly kingdoms. He's constantly, in a sovereign way, strategically placing his servants in earthly kingdoms. And that's what we see with Daniel and his friends. Incredible how God is doing this. So don't ever forget. I had a pastor years ago that used to say to people, your actions are speaking so loudly I can't hear a word you're saying. He would tell it to his kids. I lived with them for a while, and I used to always laugh. Your actions are speaking so loudly I can't hear what you're saying. You're saying something, but really you're living a different way. Listen, as we go in, this is one little side note before we go to this last point. Like, as we live as people who follow Jesus, not all of you do, and that's okay, but for those of us that say, I'm following Jesus, I'm trusting him, I believe that he's king. May everything that we do, may all the words that we speak, may our attitudes, the postures of our heart, the peace that we have inside reflect that we know God is king, no matter what takes place the next couple months in our country. May there be a resolve that, God, you are king, and I'm trusting you. And if things go a different way than I want, then God, where have you strategically placed me, like Daniel, in a place that maybe I don't like, but God, I'm going to have to trust that you want to use me there. That's who God is looking for. And that is what he's doing with Daniel. Incredibly. I love this in verse 3 and 6. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Among those chosen were from Judah, Daniel, and then we know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Remember, if it was God that handed over the nation to Babylon, to Nebuchadnezzar, and it was God that handed over all the treasuries to the king to put in his treasury, then it was God who hand-selected these men to be given to Nebuchadnezzar to be in his court. And God is always doing that. Always, always working and doing that. And he wants to do that in some of your lives and mine. Let me come back to why I was there. So we went to visit a church in London called HTB. It's Holy Trinity Brompton. It's a part of the Church of England. If you don't know a lot of that history, that would be for another coffee together. But King Henry really, really wanted a boy, and his wives just wouldn't provide them for him. So he'd kill them and start over, and didn't realize then that it was his problem and not his wife's. That's a bummer deal. I'm glad for modern technology, right, ladies? And he was a sick man, terrible, terrible man. And so he cut the Catholic Church off and said, we're starting our own. It's called the Church of England. I'm the head of it. So I can say that I can get divorced if I want to. Sick. He should not have been the head of anything but the church. Okay. So it still continues to this day. And when I think about oftentimes, or people that have shared with me about where England is at, or maybe it's specifically Church of England or just where England is at, you don't hear about, I don't know, Christianity growing there, people coming to know Jesus. You just hear about it as a nation that's turned more secular, and the churches are dying out, and churches are becoming clubs. They're becoming, I don't know, all kinds of different stores, and they're just being taken over. And so it was amazing to show up at this place, HTB, which is a Church of England, and they said early on when God started to move, this would have been in, I don't know, the early 80s, that they were asked numerous times, are you going to break off? Or are you frustrated with parts of the Church of England that don't seem orthodox or don't seem to follow the gospel? And they said, no, God birthed us in this movement. We want to stay here, and we want to change the Church of England. We want to infuse it with a revival, what they call an awakening of the gospel. And we're committed to that. And you know what? It's been amazing. I talked to a pastor. I was having breakfast with him. He was there for it too, but I didn't know him before. And he said he was visiting with his family on vacation in London, and he saw huge lines in Kensington. It's kind of an area west of London. And he just walked up to people and said, what's going on here? They're like, we're waiting for church. And he was a pastor. And he's like, what? Waiting for church? And he's like, I had to go to that church. I've never seen people wait for church. They queued it up. They would go into service, and they would stop and say, sorry, we'll start the next service in an hour and a half, and people would just wait. That service would let out, the next one would come in. And it went on like this for years and years and years. He actually went to it and flew back again because he wanted to see what God was doing. And they started something for people that were new believers, or people that didn't know really much about how to follow God. And it was called Alpha. Alpha is what we do here at our church. We do pre-marriage, we do marriage alpha. It started last week. You can still jump in. Oh, man. Nothing has been seen, viewed, and been more helpful for Christians around the world for the last 30 years than Alpha. 30 million times it's been viewed now. 30 million times. The group I was with had people from Sweden and Mexico and all kinds of different places in South America. There were so many, and they're all coming because God is using this program, and people are meeting Jesus. It was so encouraging, because so much of what we usually hear is it's all dying. And I'm like, nothing's dying around here. This church is still moving. Several thousand people planted 5 different locations in London, but now have started a network of over 200 churches, and their goal is like 3,000 in the next 10 years. And I think they'll make it. Can you show one of the pictures there? I don't even know what picture I was at first. What was the first one? There's the church. That's the group of us that were meeting, talking with the senior pastors there. You have a picture of the outside of the church. Oh, sorry, David, I forget even now what I had there. There it is. So that's HTT Brompton. Let me just give you a little background that ties into our story with Daniel before I have to close. So this is just amazing. So they're talking about how they're revitalizing all these churches. They take all the old Anglican Church of England churches that exist, and they're turning back into churches. But I mean, they're filling them with like amazing sound systems and lighting systems, and I'm just like, yeah, not everybody can be happy about this. Like, there's no way, from what I've heard of the Church of England, there's no way. And so I'm like, who's the head of the Church of England? I need to know who this is. And so I look it up, and his name is Justin Welby. And I started looking back into his story, and it was all online. And I'm just sitting there in this church. Go back to the previous picture there. That's him. But go back, yeah. I'm sitting right over here, and I'm listening to this, and I'm like, who's this Justin Welby? You can show us a picture in a minute, David. And I look it up, and he was a businessman, came out of college. He was well-educated from upper class family. And he met Jesus in college and had a personal encounter with him. So much so that it moved him to go to like a school of divinity, a seminary, and hopefully possibly go into ministry. So he went to a seminary in Oxford. Not a bad place to go to school if you're not familiar. And he comes out and was rejected. The Bishop of Kensington, a high-up bishop at the time, told him, you can find this, quote, "The Church of England has no place for you. Just remember, if God has a plan for your life, it doesn't matter." So if you didn't catch the whole story here, the current Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Church of England, was told out of seminary, the Church of England has no place for you. So he was rejected. And so he ends up trying to figure out what he's going to do in his life, and he ends up at an Alpha course at H.W. Brompton. He encounters not only Jesus, but the Holy Spirit in such a way that he's filled with the Spirit, and actually talks about this on the BBC. I was shocked that he felt like he could talk about it, but he says, I pray in tongues and spiritual language every day, ever since I had this encounter when I was in college at this church. And this church had this charismatic renewal in the early 80s, and he was part of it. So because he was rejected by the Bishop of Kensington, the vicar of this church, the bishop of this church said, I'll sponsor you, because in the Church of England, you have to be sponsored in order to become a pastor in the church. So Sandy Miller was his name. He said, I'll sponsor you, and he ordained him for ministry in the Church of England. Now, several years later, the church that is trying to revitalize all the Church of England, guess who leads the entire Church of England? Justin Welby. You can show his picture. He is the one who's head of all of this. And I was like, I don't need to ask the question, are they roadblocking you? Since his entire experience in meeting Jesus was really tied into the ministry at this church. Incredible. Incredible. In fact, the Bishop of Kensington today is leading this church's ministry for training pastors that won't have degrees, and he's retiring so he can do it full-time and send thousands of ministers out from the place that told him the Church of England has no place for you. I mean, come on, God is sovereign. In a nation that we would say God is not moving and nothing is happening, listen, our faith gets too small sometimes, and Daniel cries out to us from thousands of years ago. Make no mistake about it, even though we're in exile and we've been moved and a new powerhouse is in the block of nations, God is the sovereign king of this world. And he is placing people in positions of power. Incredible. So I just finished with this. Remember I told you we were standing out there watching the king's funeral. Go ahead and you can show the next slide. He was the presiding minister since he's the head of the Church of England. And he was sharing these words. I didn't know this whole story. I knew nothing of his connection to the church that I would be attending during these 5 days. And I'm listening to this, standing out there with 100,000 people from Britain as this pastor, and Jerry and I turned to look at each other. We're like, they had Teletrons all the way down this with speakers. And I'm like, that guy is preaching an Easter message. You're all asleep, but that's okay. It was straight up. And I'll quote it for you, part of the message. This is what he said. By the way, this was watched by more Britons than anything they've ever had on TV before, and someone said 4 billion, the news over there. They were exaggerating, kind of like the kings of old like to say that they beat everybody up. But it's not unlikely to think that 1 billion people watch this. So just think about this. In the midst of a nation that has long, it's admitted, turned its back on God, has become even pre-Christian, not even post-Christian. In a church that doesn't seem like there's any growth, God chose a man who was rejected by that church to become reordained so he could say these words to 1 billion people 2 weeks ago. The pattern for many leaders is to be exalted in life and forgotten after death. The pattern for all who serve God, famous or obscure, respected or ignored, is that death is the door to glory. Her late Majesty famously declared in her 21st birthday broadcast that her whole life would be dedicated to serving the nation, the Commonwealth. Jesus, who in our reading does not tell his disciples how to follow, but who, said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Her Majesty's example was set not through her position or her ambition, but through whom she followed. Amazing. In 1953, the Queen began her coronation with silent prayer, just there at the high altar as he was in Westminster. Her allegiance to God was given before any person gave allegiance to her. Her service to so many people in this nation, the Commonwealth, and the world had its foundation in her following Christ. God himself, who said that he came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Her late Majesty's broadcast during COVID lockdown ended with, "We will meet again." Words of hope from a song of Vera Lynn. Christian hope means certain expectation of something not yet seen. And he finished. Christ rose from the dead and offers life to all, abundant life now and life with God in eternity. As the Christmas carol says, where meek souls will receive him, still the dear Christ enters in. We all face the merciful judgment of God. We will all face the merciful judgment of God. We can all share in the Queen's hope, though, which in life and death inspired her servant leadership. I just think it was incredible that he held captive millions upon millions of people all over the world, and we're sharing them the truth about Jesus. In a nation that we would say has long forgotten and left him behind, God has left people behind because he's not dead and he is still king. He's still king. And we need to know that for our own life. Sometimes we feel like Elijah, who complained to God in 1 Kings that there was no one else around. He said, I've been zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. He actually told the Israelites that too. I'm the only one. He said it multiple times. God finally responds to him. I couldn't remember now. I think it's 7,000, not 9. But God basically tells him, you know what? I've reserved 7,000 you're not aware of. But how often we think we're the only ones. There's nothing happening. And he was basically saying, God, you don't seem to care. You don't seem to be working. And God's like, come on, I'm working. You just don't see the whole picture. Keep trusting in me, just like Daniel challenged us. So I'll close with this. It's where we get the title of the series. I think it's really interesting when we read there in verse 8 and 9, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and so he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused that official to show Daniel favor and compassion. But here's the deal. Daniel had a strict conviction about how he was supposed to live and how he wanted to bring honor to God. But I find it interesting that he asked for permission. You know what allowed him to have this posture of respect and kindness, even to someone that he wouldn't have agreed with a single thing religiously, was that he knew that God was the true king. That's it. He knew that if he was trying to live his life to honor God, to trust him, that he didn't need to bully his way in, that he didn't need to do something that would cause issue, that God would just make himself known through someone who is faithfully serving him. And I think that's a great reminder for us, because we always want to ask, where's that line? What do we do? When do we need to know to come back or to attack? And I think what Daniel shows us is God is still working and moving. And so if we think that it comes down to me to do that, I'm already wrong I'm already starting off in the wrong place. Daniel knew God was in charge of all this. So he goes with this respect and this kindness to not only this person, but it went all the way up to Nebuchadnezzar. And he was known not only as someone who was wise, but they wouldn't have called him in. They wouldn't have let him have such respect if he was just someone that was always just belligerent them or attacking them and saying things to them. But no, Daniel had this response that was respectful and kind, and it was because he knew that God was in control. And because of that, they showed him kindness and compassion back, which God then used and really capitalized on for Daniel to rise the ranks. So we'll close with this. Why don't you stand to your feet? We read this at the very beginning, and I thought this would be a fun way to end. Most of us probably didn't catch this. I didn't think about this most of the time when I read Daniel, but the last verse of chapter 1. Remember, chapter 1 starts with Nebuchadnezzar, and it ends with this last verse. And Daniel remained there in his position of, if you want to call it power or influence. He remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. So if you don't know, that's a king in a different nation. Go ahead and go to that last slide, the next one. So Daniel came to power when Nebuchadnezzar's father, was destroying the Assyrians. But it said at the very beginning, he got there when Nebuchadnezzar took him, but Daniel was still there when Cyrus became in power, which was Persia, which is another nation even bigger than Assyria and Babylon. What was Daniel telling us? God has an everlasting kingdoms. Kingdoms and kings will come and go, but God will reign forever. And may that be what gives stability and anchors our heart in difficult times. God has not left you, and he is still sovereign. Would you close your eyes with me today? Listen, maybe you say it this way. God is playing the long game. He needed Daniel for a moment, and he showed Daniel just enough to know that it's not going to end this way. Nebuchadnezzar, even Cyrus, Persia, none of these kingdoms are going to win. I am the one who's in control, even though it doesn't seem like it now. And maybe you're here today and you're in that same place. You're just wondering where God is. He hasn't seemed to show up. He hasn't seemed to do what you thought he would do, fulfill what you thought he would fulfill. Maybe it's something in your personal life. Maybe it's something just in your family or your community, our city, the nation, the world. I don't know. But you've just been struggling. God, where are you? Instead of just trying to figure it all out sometimes or take matters in your own hands, may Daniel's words bring peace and comfort today. As he was telling us so far back then to remember today that Daniel, he was just right there through all the kings, through all the nations that just would come and go. God was standing firm, and God has not left you. He is still sovereign. He is still with you. He is still with us. And when we get caught up in too many of those other things, we stop saying and asking God, God, where and how have you placed me? And how am I to live my life faithfully before you, like Daniel, trusting you? You've put me in positions of power and influence, maybe not with kings, but with somebody that I can influence their life. And maybe it's just that little someone, just like someone did for Justin Wilby, that now allowed him to be the head of the entire Church of England. God, we have no idea, but we know you're working. May we take heart and courage and comfort in that today in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.